This is Future of Water, where we talk about all the ways which companies, utilities, and people are addressing the challenges and opportunities in water. Today, I, Reese Tisdale, I'm going to speak with Bluefield's research director, Eric Bindler, about his recent attendance at WEFTEC, one of the world's largest wastewater conferences, where he was not only meeting with customers and clients, but also he was able to gauge some key trends or perspectives on what's happening in the world of water. So rather than diving into specific topic this week, I think we were actually planning on talking about water quality and bottled water. We thought we'd seize on Eric's insights that he gleaned in Chicago earlier this week. And not only that, Eric's always a great guest to have on because he's got a wealth of perspectives on water and certainly talks to a lot of people. So before we do that, I just wanted to share one news item I think we brought up on the Future Water in the past, and that is a news item. The long-awaited, for some, acquisition of O&M services provider ESG Operations finally took place. You got it. Private equity-owned Inframark acquired the company, which I believe is based in Georgia. It adds to Inframark's municipal contract positions in the South and Southeast, where actually both ESG and Inframark are strongest. ESG also has positions in other sectors, not just water. So it'll be interesting to see how and if this can influence Inframark's strategy to address its weaker position in the industrial sectors. I know it's struggled with that over the past couple of years. So this might be a catalyst through an existing team to build that out. And for that matter, post-acquisition by New Mountain Capital, Inframark brought in a new CEO this past summer to lead the company forward. And I believe he came from Valacor. So there might be further industrial bent from that management perspective as well. That's the only news item I have this week. So I know there's a lot going on, but I thought I'd just stick with that, make it quick and dirty, because Eric and I, what I believe, had a great conversation. So let's get to it. All right. So I'm joined here today by Eric Bindler, Research Director of Bluefield Research. Eric, how's it going?
Doing pretty well. How about you, Reese?
Pretty good. Just living the dream. Doesn't have to be my dream, just a dream, as I would say. But, well, Eric, let's get right to it. I mean, I think, the conference circuit seems to be picking up little by little. I know there's some activity. You and I actually have crossed paths earlier midsummer at a conference in Atlanta, but then more recently, earlier this week, you went to WEFTEC, which I don't, could we call that the world's largest water conference, or it's really wastewater focused primarily?
Yeah, it's got to be up there. It's pretty big. I mean, we can get into how it panned out this year versus past years, but I think it's typically around 20,000. That's the number that we usually throw out there, right?
Yeah. So, all right. Well, I mean, you said it. So it's typically 20,000. It's pretty big. And actually before COVID hit, Bluefield, we did breakfast, client breakfast, where we would present our takeaways and findings on what we thought was interesting in the market. We did it, I think, in New Orleans. We've done it in Chicago, among other places. But 20,000 people, it's a lot of people. To me, it felt like the trade floor itself was huge. And then you have the conference on top of that. So you just went for a day earlier this week for client meetings, but also just to sort of see what's happening in the world of water, at least in today's environment. So 20,000 people, were there 20,000 people there?
No, definitely not. I was kind of asking around if anybody had any stats, and the number that came out was about a third of the normal attendance. So, probably 7,000 people compared to 20,000, right? So, it's obviously a lot smaller. It's great to see that people were able to get out again. And I think it was a good mix. I mean, just looking at who was, at the trade floor, who was exhibiting, it was a good mix of, the kind of standard cast of characters, the pipe companies, the pup companies, the operations crews doing the kind of operations challenges and that kind of thing, a bunch of software companies. It was a good mix. Engineering firms certainly were there in mass, but it was kind of eerie, I guess, because if you've been to WEFTEC at Chicago in the past, and you've been to the McCormick Convention Center. Usually, WEFTEC kind of takes over like both halves of the exhibit hall, right? It's this massive sprawling thing, and here everybody was just confined to one half. The other half was totally closed down except for the registration. So it was a little bit weird to see, but there were people walking around. I mean, I think people said it did feel quieter than usual. It felt kind of low key, but it was nice to see people out there, and I think everybody was really happy to be kind of meeting up with their colleagues again, meeting up with friends. It was good that it was able to happen for sure.
Is it I mean, did you get a sense, were the booths the same size? I mean, I know there are a couple, obviously the blue chip water companies, typically they'll have these, what I would call, it's relative, but these sprawling booths with, lounge areas and TVs and such. I mean, was that the same, as before, or was it dialed back?
I think it was dialed back. I mean, some of the big players, like Xylem and Mueller and companies like that, they had pretty big floor space, but I do think there weren't as many of them that kind of sprung for that huge piece of real estate, and I do think they were smaller overall.
What about the profile of people? Obviously, in my mind, and given, like I said, we met at a conference midsummer, was that, salespeople, business development people, I mean, this is their bread and butter, and this, and that's where they make deals, but also they just want to be with people. I mean, at the end of the day, they're not analysts. They're not buried in their computer. They want to be out there talking to people. Did you get a sense for, the types of people who were there? Did you see senior executives, or was it sort of still a range?
Yeah, I mean, I met with a couple senior executives. In terms of people that were working booths, I think it depends on the size of the company. Certainly, I was kind of spent a lot of my time. I didn't have a ton of time to walk the floor because I had a bunch of meetings, but I spent a couple hours out there, and I was trying to. There's that innovation pavilion that's got a bunch of the smaller kind of digital water players. So I spent some time over there, and I think typically the CEOs will come out for WEFTEC if it's a small company, right? But I tried to go check out some of our larger clients and see if senior executives were there, and I think they typically weren't. So maybe for the larger companies, it's more the salespeople, the regional sales directors, biz dev type people. But for the larger ones, maybe less of a priority to come to WEFTEC at this point.
Yeah, and not that we have the answer, but I guess my last point on WEFTEC and ACE and these larger water conferences in the U.S. or we have Chloe Meyer, a colleague of ours, she's going to Aquatech next week, I believe. And then we've got Nina and another colleague, Steph, are going to the ESRI, I think it's user conference. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. This is a real test case for how people feel, how comfortable they are. There are different restrictions around the country, if not the rest of the world. So how people are, what are they defining or determining what their comfort levels are, this will be telling. And it'll be telling, or at least maybe an indicator of what's to happen next year, because that may be the real tell.
Yeah, I know it's a fair point. And I mean, the thing that was interesting about WEFTEC compared to, UMC in Atlanta, for example, is that for WEFTEC, I think you could either present proof of vaccination or maybe you could present proof of a negative COVID test beforehand. I don't remember that part, but I think they were obviously highly encouraging people to be vaccinated. So far so good on my front, but I mean, obviously when you've got that many people, even with the vast majority vaccinated, some breakthrough cases are going to pop up. Obviously, hopefully it doesn't turn into a major event and it, puts a damper on the rest of the events, but we'll see if I get any more news on that.
Nice. Well, let's jump to sort of some of the nitty gritty though, at least. I mean, it sounds like there were a couple of product launches that you came across. I mean, any insights on that end of the spectrum?
Yeah. I mean, I think, WEFTEC as well as ACE, they historically are kind of a launching pad for a bunch of new products. Companies kind of plan up their big announcement of the year to coincide with these events. And so I did come across a couple interesting ones. So one pretty, big company, one pretty small company. I'll leave it to two. So Kando, the Israeli wastewater quality monitoring player, they're, really interesting company, and they're just launching what they're calling Pulse, which is kind of basically a new dashboard platform for tracking the data that they collect. A big part of what they're trying to focus on is helping utilities identify wastewater pollution from their industrial clients, right? So if all of a sudden the wastewater coming in to their treatment plan is not in line with their kind of standards or their pre-treatment programs, their compliance programs, they have an idea of what's coming, and they can also go talk to those polluting firms and say, hey, we've got data showing that you dumped this at this time on this day, and we need you to to kind of stop doing that. So, and they've got some interesting kind of algorithms at work to try to predict which industry, which client could be responsible based on wastewater quality that they're tracking. They've got like industry footprints depending on the types of contaminants or the types of compounds that different industries put into their wastewater. So I thought that was pretty interesting. I think they've been more of a data, they have this data as a service business model. They're providing the data, but now they're really trying to put this higher level dashboard together to just present the insights versus just kind of dumping a bunch of data on their clients, which, seems like a good move in this environment. The other that was pretty interesting was Schneider Electric. So obviously a big kind of SCADA automation player, strong position in the global wastewater industry. And they're launching some products that are moving in the direction of open automation, which I'll admit is not a debate that I've been following too closely, but I think essentially the idea is, traditionally SCADA systems and automation systems in the industry, it's the kind of IP is very much held by the systems integrators, right? If you're a utility, you hire a local systems integrator to come in and set up your plant. And all of that code, all of the logic that they're programming in so that your PLCs, your RTUs are kind of, all speaking with each other. They're executing the commands that you want them to control your plant. All of that code is basically owned by the systems integrator. And if the utility wants to put in a new piece of software 20 years down the line or put in new hardware 20 years down the line, they're really stuck, right? They're really kind of beholden to that initial integrator. And so it seems like what at least Schneider is doing, and I'll admit I haven't looked at some of the other competitors in terms of where they sit in this space, but Schneider is trying to invest in this idea of open automation where the whole kind of system architecture is much less dependent on the specific pieces of hardware that have the specific code, the specific logic built in. And it'll really give utilities more flexibility to change out devices, change out applications in the future. And so it'll be interesting to see if that takes off. I mean, I think their point was that it was very early days. It's kind of an initial investment or initial bet on this movement, because they do have the scale to kind of take that risk, but we'll see. I think it's a really interesting concept, and it has the potential to really change the way that SCADA is done, the way that systems integration is done, and the way that utilities are kind of, thinking about SCADA in relation to the broader digital water landscape.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it kind of gets to one of those age-old problems, whether a closed architecture or platform versus open source, right? And so, and I know that scares conversations that I've had with utilities. They're not big fans of locking themselves into one black box, right? And because then things change, times change. So when they do that, are they going to be stuck? And other solutions may come along. So this is an interesting play. And like you said, Schneider is they're big. They can afford to make a move like this. Whereas, to your point, when you talk about Kando, they're much smaller, right? And so they're sort of, while these are completely different, but just to highlight the differences of strategies between the large industrial or diversified companies versus the smarter or smaller, should I say, more niche or focused companies. So interesting. So no, that's helpful. I mean, like you said, these conferences are big events for new product launches. So I don't know how that is gonna, a new conference type environment, how that changes the game. I guess people will just go back to the press releases and the webcast and user conferences, things like that to make product launches until things settle out. But like you said, there are at least a couple at WEFTEC this week. What about other takeaways? I mean, you're having conversations with people. What's keeping people up at night when it comes to the water sector?
Yeah, I mean, I had a lot of really good conversations with some clients, some non-clients, just some friends from the industry, and I was kind of looking through my notes trying to pick together what were some of those common themes. Were there any issues that really stood out that a lot of people were talking about? And I think probably the I'll talk through maybe two or three, but there's one in particular that I think is really interesting that we've been talking about internally to a certain extent as well. And that's the kind of staffing and hiring issues that are going on in the industry. I think we this year have spent a lot of time talking about supply chain issues, right? We're talking about on kind of the supply side, the challenges that tech companies are having with semiconductors, the price of copper or plastic, PVC. But there's another, I guess, kind of supply side challenge that a lot of companies, certainly not just in water, but across the economy, are facing, and that's kind of the human resources side of things, right? It's not only finding new talent and filling your current openings, thinking about the workforce of the future, for example, getting those talents and those capabilities that you need to position for the next decade. But it's also just keeping your current people on staff and dealing with wage pressures, right? Wages are certainly going up in some sectors. We keep hearing about this great resignation, right? Where people are kind of quitting en masse to go look for new opportunities. So there's a lot. These trends are certainly not exclusive to the water industry, but I think it's interesting to think about how they trickle down into water. And I'd say there were maybe two big points that came out of those conversations. The first one is really specifically the digital skill sets, right? Like, the more that we're talking about digital transformation in the industry, obviously a lot of that is products, it's software, it's services, but you need people to, design and build those products. You need people to offer those services. And that goes both for the vendors as well as for the utilities, right? I talked to, people from engineering firms, for example, like large national or international engineering firms, and they're even having trouble kind of attracting and affording tech talent, right? Because even out of school, you have data scientists, data analysts, computer programmers that are asking for 6-digit salaries, like with 1 or 2 years of experience, right? So it's really tough even for the vendors to kind of hire that talent, especially when they're competing with the Googles and the Facebooks of the world, other tech startups, other industries that might have more cash, more perks to kind of offer. But then you get down to the level of the utility, right? Because we're also talking about utilities and their digital transformation. They need people, staff that have these digital skill sets to bring to bear. And if a large international engineering firm can't afford a data scientist right out of college, there's no way in hell that a utility is going to, right? So, not to mention they've also got issues with, very long, just like their long procurement cycles, they have really long hiring processes. There's a lot of bureaucracy that candidates would have to wade through if they wanted to work for a utility. And so I talked to, one of my friends at a utility that is, they're just having so much trouble getting those types of people. Like he's like, we're not getting top tier. We're not getting even mid-tier talent. We're getting kind of the bottom of the barrel in terms of those, data science, data analytics, computer science type positions.
And that's what scares people, right? I mean, we already talked a little bit about sort of the open source software or, solutions out there, but then also the talent itself. That's a whole nother problem that scares people because, even if you get younger people out of college, out of graduate school, they come into a utility, let's say, you want them to stick around, right? Obviously, you don't want to just train them up. It's incredibly competitive. And so is that a potential, I mean, I guess you're raising the point, that could be a real barrier to digital adoption, or at least a throttle on what actually happens, because like anybody else, this digital wave, it's happening so fast. There's so many solutions out there being thrust upon utilities. They may or may not understand it, but they still need someone to manage it. And they can't necessarily afford to pay, I don't think, like you said, 6-figure plus salaries out of the gate. And so, when you weigh that against engineering firms who are pushing a lot of these things and they're having trouble, yeah, that's pretty tough. I mean, what about, so that's a critical issue. What about like remote workforce management? Anybody bring that up at all?
Yeah, so I've been thinking about that too. Nobody really brought it up. I think but it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Because, I remember in the early days of COVID, we had people telling us that, as much as 60, 70, 80% of utility staff were switched to remote to work from home, positions, at least in the short term, right? At least during lockdowns and that kind of thing. And I do know that, utilities have been bringing people back to work, but it'll be interesting to see how flexible those work arrangements continue to be for the industry, right? I mean, we're hearing all over the place in tech and finance, all of these like large companies are really struggling with whether they continue to allow people to work remotely and continue to hire people remotely to be able to attract kind of a broader pool of talent. And also just, if you're top talent and you've gotten used to working from home for the past year and a half, you don't necessarily want to go back to the office, and people are quitting on that basis, right? A lot of industries are seeing, that's one of the pressures on kind of employee retention is if you're forcing your people back to the office and they don't want to come, then they're going to go find a job where they can stay in their living room, right? So I haven't really heard anybody talk about that in the context of the utility sector. And it's kind of a different animal because utilities, it's such a localized business, right? Like, the assets that you're managing are there in the city with you, right? Or in the community. And so it's really hard to imagine the kind of maximum flexibility of, I don't know, Louisville Water hiring a data scientist in Ontario, right? Like, I don't know. It's hard to imagine that it could get to that level, but certainly in terms of at least allowing people to work from home a few days a week, maybe be in the community, but not have to come into the office every day. I could see that continuing to the extent that utilities felt that they were able to manage the pandemic and manage that remote work. And I think many of them were pretty successful. But it'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to see if that move to bring people back into the office ends up costing them some of that talent that they have been building up over the years.
Well, I'll go out on a flyer here also, and that is, does that present a potential opportunity for a third party like O&M or outsourcing, right? So if you're a utility, so you said Louisville Water, we'll just go with that as a representative example. If they have needs, whether it be software, data management, or just basic O&M, is it rather than trying to bring someone internal who's in Ontario or, Canada or California for that matter, and trying to get them to move to Louisville, maybe there's already a third party that has the scale and actually the business model to address a lot of those concerns. So is it easier just to outsource it? So does that wave of as a service model, does that continue? Does it accelerate even more for utilities? Because, I think prior to COVID, maybe I'm wrong, I'll speak in the case of Bluefield. It seemed to be easier if someone was in, I'm in Boston, our main office is here, but if someone is in Atlanta and we say, hey, there's a job here, the expectation is that they would ultimately move to Boston. Now it's a little bit harder. That discussion's a little bit different. And maybe they have other opportunities, right? They're like, well, I can stay in my place, in Atlanta, close to family, friends, where I already am. I don't need to do it. So this will be interesting to see what happens with not only the utilities, but just anybody pushing or selling is a better way to put it, the digital solutions, to your first point about, data, but just basic hiring itself. What about anybody bring up, out of curiosity, like vaccine mandates or anything like that? Is that going to be part of the Great Resignation as well?
Yeah, absolutely. That was the other point I was thinking about. So the remote from the work from home, remote work thing didn't come up, but the vaccine mandates definitely did. And I think, the same type of situation we're seeing. Companies in the industry that have that do federal government work right now. There's kind of vaccine mandates in the U.S. at least, right? We're kind of talking in the context of the U.S. market. U.S. kind of federal government employees have vaccine mandates. There are a number of municipalities, big cities around the country that are also kind of rolling out vaccine mandates for their workers. I'm here in Chicago. We're seeing a lot of kind of back and forth between the Chicago Police Department and the mayor, in that sense. But also, vendors that work in the digital water space or just in the water industry that also do work for the federal government. They're kind of also by proxy having to put these vaccine requirements in place because, I don't know exactly what the language of the law is, but essentially it's pretty broad in the sense that any company that's doing business or anybody that's working in an office with somebody who could have a federal contracting gig has to also be vaccinated, right? And so obviously I think are on the same page politically about the benefit of those types of requirements. We're not trying to get too far in the weeds in that sense, but I do sympathize with the position of some of those employers that are really, seeing a lot of people or expecting to see a lot of their people quit because either they don't want to get vaccinated, or I even heard of, people that are vaccinated but just disagree politically with or philosophically with that vaccine mandate, and they're threatening to quit as well. So, again, like the kind of labor issues, there's the utility piece of it, and certainly workforce shortages for utilities open the door to, as you said, O&M, outsourced O&M contracts, and data as a service or software data as a service or managed service models. But also from the vendor perspective, if they're also losing people because of either their remote work policies, their vaccine policies, there's a lot of churn in the industry right now, and it's going to be really interesting to see who gets out on top of it, and what the industry looks like by this time next year.
Yeah, I think, I have strong feelings about it. I think people should, I'm not going to lie, I think people should get vaccinated. I don't feel like that's a great stand to make. But the other thing is, I've worked in the oil and gas sector as well as a contractor. We all used to have to get drug tested. It wasn't a question, right? So it was not only I'd walk in the office at 7:30 in the morning, and someone would stick a tube in my mouth and say, breathe into it, see if I'd been drinking. Then they'd later in the week or some other time, they'd be like, hey, you need to go down to the lab or the doctor or whatever you want to call it. And I'd get drug tested. It's not that big of a deal. So that's my perspective. There you have it. Go get vaccinated, save a life. But changing gears a little bit. So you're walking the trade floor, having meetings. Typically when we go to these, it's always interesting when you're at conferences, you kind of see, you see suits sometimes. That's one way to look at it. You see people walking around. People who are interested in the water sector who want to invest in it, or other companies that kind of stand out. You see a name tag and say, that's interesting. I didn't know they were in water, or they're obviously looking. Any new market entrants or outsiders looking in that you came across?
Yeah, there were a couple people that kind of stood out. Just when I looked through the roster prior to getting to the conference, but also just walking the floor and having conversations. We do our best. There's a lot of startups in the space, right? There's a lot of new companies that are forming to tackle water, especially in the digital water space. That's my kind of wheelhouse. But what's, I think, always interesting to me is to see a company that's pretty well established in another industry that's trying to find a way to push into water, right? And I do think we've seen a lot of that, especially since COVID. The part of what I chalk it up to, at least, is when we had that period of time when so many businesses were shut down, so many industries were kind of shuttered. You look around and what's still happening, right? Where is business still happening? And it was the water industry, right? Water was a critical sector. A lot of the vendors that supply water were able to kind of stay up and running because they were supplying a critical infrastructure sector. And so I think that's maybe further increased that curiosity about the water industry from outside, from adjacent industries. And also just, I feel like water is more and more, the more we talk about climate change and drought and water scarcity and flooding. Water is in the news a lot. And I think it's really pushing people to think about how they could adopt their existing technologies, their capabilities, their expertise to help solve problems in the water industry. And so there were a couple of firms in particular that I came across. You were talking about the booths earlier. There was actually one company that had a pretty big booth that I'd never heard of. And I went to go see who they were, what they were up to. And they're kind of a GIS software services company that's done stuff in transportation and land management, but they're kind of pushing into water. They launched a solution for water utilities, or a couple solutions for water utilities. So that was interesting. Also heard about, kind of an IoT company that's doing stuff in healthcare in the power sector that is trying to push into water as well. So, not a ton of examples. I was only there for a day, but it does kind of, I think, support that hypothesis that more and more investors, whether they be financial investors, big strategics from other industries, or just kind of entrepreneurs that have a good product in an adjacent sector, they're trying to find a way into water.
To add to that, just from the Bluefield perspective, and I think I've said this on this podcast before, and that is private equity players. Holy cow. There seems to be there's a lot of buzz in the air. So I don't know if it's just been coming in waves all year, quite honestly. I would say starting in February, March timeframe, and since then it's just surges one after another for Bluefield, for companies interested in trying to, either they have companies identified or they're trying to figure out certain segments to look at. So that's interesting in and of itself, and somewhat unique. But like you said, it's always interesting for me to look at other critical infrastructure service providers or asset owners looking at the water sector. And I'd say you're exactly right. I think drought in California helps. I think if you look at the Wall Street Journal or Bloomberg in any given day, they're talking about ESG and sort of climate initiatives, like you said. Money is still cheap, and there seems to be a lot of it. And so, people, companies, management teams are looking for opportunities for long-term growth. And the water sector definitely provides that. It's unique. It's not an easy, quick turn always, but yeah. So that's interesting. What other let's make it 3. So you talked a little bit about staffing and hiring, talked about new market entrants. What else is on your list for key takeaways?
Yeah, I mean, the last one, I think, is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. And we talk about it a good amount. We've put out research notes on it and that kind of thing, but it's the small and mid-sized utility market, right? I think, one of the maybe early realizations I had as I started working on this digital piece of the market was so much of the activity is really confined to the largest utilities, right? The large urban utilities that have, pretty big budgets, big, decently sized staff. They've got some, to our point earlier about staffing, they've got some digital skill sets internally that they can kind of bring to bear on understanding the technology landscape, at least to a certain extent. But those utilities, those larger utilities, make up such a small fraction of the total kind of universe of water and wastewater organizations in the US and the world, right? I mean, the US is maybe one of the extreme examples, but there are so many other markets that have that same pattern where there's only, only maybe 1 to 5%, 10% of the total utilities serve more than 50,000 people, right? The vast majority are serving fewer than 50,000 people. And so when you get down into that level, you've got very different needs in terms of the problems that they're trying to solve, very, very different levels of kind of technical sophistication, very different budgets, different price points. And I think more and more people are talking about that. That I've come across a number of really interesting, especially startups, I'd say, in the past, year or two that are specifically targeting that slice of the market and trying to find ways of just getting basic digital tools into the hands of these small utilities to make, to help them. In many cases, they've got the same problems as larger utilities, but fewer resources to tackle them, right? So if they can get even some basic digital technology to make themselves more efficient, to make their operations more resilient, it's a really big benefit, from a financial perspective, but also just kind of from a social and environmental perspective. So I think that's really interesting. And like I said, a lot of startups are in that space, but I'm seeing more and more other people in the industry talk about it. I'm seeing more kind of like nonprofits and industry associations talk about it. I'm seeing more financial investors talk about it. I'm seeing even some of the larger companies. I talked to some of our bigger kind of digital water incumbent clients at WEFTEC, and they were bringing up this point of like, hey, we're going to, not that they said it in quite these terms, but, at some point you run out of new customers if you're only targeting those few hundred utilities or that serve more than 1 million people or more than 500,000 people. You kind of run out of new real estate pretty quickly, right? And I think the larger players are realizing that more and more as well, that they need to figure out a way to tweak their technology, their pricing, especially their business models to make themselves relevant for that smaller slice of the market.
Yeah, because I mean, to your point, those large ones are also incredibly competitive too, right? All the big players are going after them. And when you're looking at, like you said, a couple hundred large systems, then you go down to the smaller end of the spectrum and you're looking like 25 or 30,000.
And that's just in the US.
That's just in the US. You're exactly right. So you're just scaling them. Scaling is difficult, right? You got to figure out how to hop from one stone to the next to tie them all together. And sometimes their needs are pretty basic, right? I mean, we're starting, we have that, what's the right? It's sort of like a utility curve, right? Of asset management, sort of where do utilities stand in the adoption curve of digital technologies, and do they meet certain criteria? And, a good example of that, and what it makes me think of it, just first thing this morning, I was listening to another podcast. It was actually Marketplace Tech, and they were talking about cybersecurity in the water, wastewater sector, talking about the challenges that I mean, essentially, is our water supply at risk to cybersecurity threats and hacks, right? There was no real answer. There's no one really ultimately responsible other than the individual utilities, but a lot of these small ones, they're using dated Microsoft software, basic systems. They did raise the Oldsmar, Florida example, which I think we've actually talked about on this podcast and done some research on, more broadly speaking. But because of remote workforces, because of the Internet of Things and digital adoption, and just hey, that's the new is it a new kind of, I don't know if you want to call it warfare. Sooner or later, it's going to be called terrorism, but I promise it will if it's not already. But they are at risk, right? And to to either ransomware attacks or asset shutdowns or threats. And so yeah, there is real opportunity there. I mean, at the end of the day, the sum of all those little systems is actually huge. It just may not, and so that meets certain company strategies. You've got certain companies that are whale hunters, like a Suez or Veolia is a good example. But then there are others out there that are sort of targeting that sector. So no, I think it's interesting. It will be interesting to see how that plays out. It's a little scary too, right? We're talking water quality, but also does the system work?
Right.
Well, all right, with that, I mean, it seems like that's a lot for a day's work.
Yeah, it was a busy day.
Yeah. So, and then it sounds like you had drinks afterwards. So,
Yep.
nice. Well, I'm sure it's good to be back talking to people in person. But, well, as usual, what are you working on?
Yeah, so the main thing on my plate right now is, and it's going to be out very soon, I hope, is some work that we've been doing on the kind of digital water vendor landscape. Right, we've got a little over 900 companies that we've kind of profiled. We've got a bunch of data on who are they, where are they, what do they do, what's their VC status, VC backing, are they hardware software services companies, that kind of thing. Globally, right? We've been looking at this kind of global database of vendors that we've come across in one form or another. So trying to just get a deck together on that. So that should be out for the digital water service pretty soon. And then we'll have kind of a corresponding database on our data navigator platform where you can actually drill in a little bit more and start looking at, who are some of these companies, where are they located? We see it being super valuable for M&A type work, right? If you're kind of looking at maybe a specific region and a specific product type, and you want to find some potential M&A targets, that's one way that it could be useful, or for venture investors as well. So I'm excited about it. I think it's going to be great to have that out in the service. And as soon as that's done, I'm going to turn back to getting our global digital water forecast finished up.
Fantastic. Yeah, I look forward to that data set of all the companies. I mean, this has evolved over time. We've been building and building from a lot of different angles, right? We started it a while back, which has been useful. And then, we've been looking at private equity players, investors in the site, what's their role, who's owned by private equity or venture backed or by strategics, and so on and so forth. So that'll be great. And I'm not going to lie, those digital forecasts will be exciting to look at as well. So, well, Eric, thanks again, particularly on short notice, and for offering your insights on WEFTEC and what's going on in Chicago. So thanks a million.
Absolutely. Great to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. Take care, and we'll talk soon.
Take care. Thanks.
All right. So before we sign off, all I ask is that you please subscribe to the Future Water podcast. Also, why don't you try out the Water Values podcast by Dave and Gimpsey? That's a good one. And you can give all of them a review on the Apple Podcast platform, but just subscribe in Spotify and Apple and all the other podcast platforms. If you have any questions about this podcast or any of the others, or just what we're talking about, you can reach out to us at waterexperts@bluefieldresearch.com. It's a good place to share any topic ideas you'd like us to discuss, or just answer any questions. We're doing this for you, as always. Lastly, tell a friend about it. It's always a good thing to do. Might be a good excuse to do so. This podcast and these water industry insights have been brought to you by the one and only Bluefield Research. To learn more about us, visit us at bluefieldresearch.com. Until we talk again, be well, take care, be safe.